A week ago, our Senator, Claire McCaskill, was in town to deliver a speech at Drury University in which she announced a new initiative to combat rape on college campuses. Rape is a problem on college campuses. And so, on the one hand, it's good to hear that she's against it. But as politics goes, is there a pro-rape constituency? Notwithstanding some of the colossally stupid things that have been said by some of our other Missouri politicians, it's actually difficult to imagine that Claire was risking a lot of political capital by going on record as being opposed to college rape. One of my former associate ministers, who took a church of her own several years ago, decided that she would try to follow in my pathway of being a writer for the local paper. And as soon as she took her first parish, she wrote a passionate opinion column in which she decisively announced her opposition to child abuse. Now, that was more than 10 years ago, and we have yet to see the opposing article to be published that would go on record being in favor of child abuse. You may think that I've made a career out of tilting at windmills, but I can defend myself by saying that there was at least always a windmill there when I got on my horse and started charging. But let's go back to Claire. Our senator came to town to announce her opposition to rape on college campuses a scant week after she had publicly fought a bill sponsored by Senator Kristen Gillibrand of New York. Senator Gillibrand's bill would have removed the trial process of rape in the military from military courts, where they currently have a backlog of 1,600 cases that have not even been investigated yet, and many estimate that fewer than 1 in 10 rapes in the military are actually reported because of the horrific way that these cases are handled in the military. The case for Gillibrand's bill was bolstered just before Senator McCaskill voted against it by the news that Brigadier General Jeffrey Sinclair had pled guilty to having repeatedly raped a woman under his command and threatened to murder her and her family if she told anyone. That news was backed up by a sexual assault charge against Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Morse, who is the Army's chief prosecutor in military sexual assault cases. I think that Claire McCaskill is a smart woman. I like her politics a whole lot more than her former political opponent, Todd Legitimate Rape Aiken. And to be fair, I'm certain that Claire is actually opposed to rape in the military as well as on college campuses and probably everywhere else. I think we can intuit that. The difference is that when she had the opportunity to do something significant about it, she decided to vote with the likes of Rand Paul and Lindsey Graham to please her Fort Leonard Wood constituency. This banner we commissioned for our church that features the winged lion upholding a tablet that reads, "Thou shalt not stand idly by." The quote comes from Elie Wiesel's Nobel Prize acceptance speech, in which he said that the Holocaust only happened because most people simply watched it happen. Genocide can only happen if the majority of the population decides not to get involved. I had latched onto that quote many years ago, and those of you who've been in my home have seen a ceramic relief I had made for my mantelpiece by a different artist, because for me it expresses the core of what I think a prophetic ministry is to be about. It sums up as well my sense of disappointment with most of my experience in denominational religion, that they stand idly by all the time. There was a period of my life when I was very connected to denominational affairs in the church of my birth. And when I say affairs, sometimes I mean that quite literally. I became aware of allegations of sex crimes committed by the former general minister and president of the Disciples of Christ, C. William Nichols. The denomination had a long-standing history of paying off the victims of his sexual abuse. And when I was invited to be the pastor of the denomination's National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., capital city Christian church. He had been serving as the interim, and there were people on staff who had accused him of using church money to pay them to have sex with him. I insisted on notifying the police, but the response of the denomination was to pay off the people that were making allegations to buy their silence, and they actually threatened to sue me for talking about it. I reached out to members of the clergy from the West Coast to the East Coast. I sent emails to more than 6,000 pastors asking them to get involved in this case. And I did not get a positive response from any of them. I got several dozen negative responses of people telling me to be quiet about it and to take them off my email list. I really couldn't believe the conspiracy of silence, even after the Catholic priest scandals had been in the news for years. When it comes right down to potentially harming your own institution, your own denomination, the place that holds your pension funds, there's not a lot of love of principle. Standing idly by has become a sacrament to organized religion. To commanding officers who are aware of tens of thousands of military sexual assaults, standing idly by is the sacrament of choice. To popes, bishops, priests, and pastors who hide pedophilia, to solid, salt-of-the-earth, church-going folks who don't want to shine a light of injustice on injustice, or even know too much about it, or even know enough to have to get involved. Isn't it interesting that in our 24-hour news cycle, that 23 and a half hours are devoted to speculating about the disappearance of an airplane when there is no hard evidence to go on? We don't want to know about things that really we could do something about, but we will speculate endlessly on things about which there are no answers and about which we can do nothing. Army officers can say to elected politicians, "We want to govern ourselves and we do not want to be held accountable for our misconduct." And politicians say in reply, "We will make sure that no one holds you responsible." Long after this national conspiracy to hide sex crimes in the Disciples of Christ Church, I reported 2 incidents of embezzling, one at the national level and one out of our Springfield, Ozark Lakes area office. Both were swept under the rug. I actually went to board meetings in the Ozark Lakes area for 2 years demanding an audit because it had become clear to me that tens of thousands of dollars were disappearing every year. And they actually went back and changed the minutes of those meetings to remove my demands for an audit. No criminal charges were ever filed in either case. Responsible parties between the 2 incidents made off with more than $500,000. Nothing was done. I couldn't even get our local paper to run a story on the crime, even though I'm a writer. I wrote several articles about it, all of which were rejected. Because no legal charges were filed, all discussions of the embezzlement took place within personnel conversations that are not open to the sunshine laws. So even though everyone knew that it happened, there was no paper trail that could be followed to substantiate a story. The area minister even kept his job. Lives in this neighborhood right over here over the hill, which I have to tell you, this is not something I'm proud of, but when we bought this building and I knew he drives down this street on his way to and from work, that's why I had my name put in large block letters on the sign out front. I just felt like even if he could get the silence of every other minister in the area, he couldn't get my silence, and he needs to remember that I'm here. When we went downtown a couple of years ago to protest the anti-illegal immigrant measure being voted on by the city council, there were some of my old denominational peers out there carrying signs. They, like we, were protesting the inherent xenophobia behind this E-Verify movement. But the irony that struck me hard that day was that they had refused to get involved in ethical matters that they actually governed. They actually had a vote. They sat on the board. They could control that unethical conduct about which they refuse to say a word, but when it comes to protesting something they can't control, where they're giving advice to the city council or to the state government, they're willing to stand up and have their voices heard. But where their voices really control things, they only vote not present. When it comes to telling city government how they should be ethical, great. When it comes to telling their own church institution, they hear no evil, see no evil, and refuse to speak out against evil. Albert Einstein said that great spirits have always found violent opposition from mediocre minds. The latter cannot understand it when a person does not thoughtlessly submit to the hereditary prejudices, but honestly and courageously uses their intelligence. If you stand up to the injustices of the world, you will find yourself immediately in possession of a large number of enemies. Almost every one of them, however, will reveal themselves to be mediocre, not only in intellect, but in morality and in courage. Paul wrote to the Roman church warning them that they would endure opposition, that they would be suffering if they stood for anything. But if you practice standing up to injustice, then you gain endurance, and that endurance will produce depth of character. And if enough people practice depth of character, the world has to change. But folks, we've created for ourselves this little liberal enclave out here. We have this progressive church where we gather with fairly consistently like-minded people, and we can meet here once a week and decry the hypocrisy of politicians, priests, and corporations, the corporations that own the politicians and the priests. But that can become just another way of standing idly by. There's no substantive reward for holding informed, liberal, progressive thoughts if you hold them privately. I printed on the cover of the bulletin this morning this delightful picture of a girls' soccer team all wearing traditional Muslim headscarves called the hijab. Now, this is not a soccer team in Bahrain or Indonesia. This is in Aurora, Colorado. Even though the Soccer Association had ruled that women could wear a hijab during games, one referee sent the only Muslim girl on the team off the field. Now, I've seen high school friends shave their heads in solidarity with a classmate who was undergoing chemotherapy, and that's a sacrifice. It's a noble gesture, but it's not like there's a pro-cancer club in the high school. It's a symbolic act, but their hair will grow back whether their friend survives their illness or not. But these Colorado girls deciding to identify with a Muslim teammate, that looks really different to me. I teach world religions. I would never say this in front of my students, but I don't like the fact that Muslims ask women to cover up in ways that men don't have to. I think it's unfair. I think it's sexist. I think it's misogynistic. I don't want to go on record being critical of Islam in general, because I think we do need to respect other world religions. But when it comes down to the practices that Muhammad did not teach, it's not an inherent part of Islam, but it is part of Muslim practice, to make women objectified in ways that men are not. I don't like it. And I think it even poses some security risk for people to be able to enter banks and airports and even stores with their identities partially or entirely hidden. There are a reason why we have security cameras. I suspect that a number of these girls on this soccer team may have felt a lot of the same way that I do about the hijab, but they put one on anyway. They didn't wear a hijab to defend Islam. They wore it rather to defend a single person who was their friend who was being discriminated against by a referee who was being a jerk. They wore it rather than putting their arm around their Muslim teammate, as we so often would do, and tell her, "I sure am sorry you got such a raw deal." They were not simply opinionated about injustice. They were unwilling to stand idly by. The Holocaust would not have happened if the people of Germany, Russia, Latvia, Slovakia, the Netherlands, and Poland had not let it happen. That story we've all heard about how the Germans ordered the Jews in Denmark to wear a Star of David, and the next day the King Christian of Denmark came riding out on his horse with a Jewish star sewn onto his coat. That didn't happen. Great story, didn't happen, nothing like it ever happened. In fact, nothing like that happened anywhere in Europe. We wish the people of Europe had done something like that. We wished it so much, we made up a story and we've told it to ourselves as if it were history. But the fact is, it didn't happen. There were 3.5 million Jews living in Poland before the war. There was 500,000 Jews that survived, 3 million. Half the people killed in the Holocaust came out of one country. The story about the girls in Overland High School wearing the hijab to their soccer game, now that happened. That's historical, and it should happen more often and in more places. But you would never have the courage and self-awareness to stop a Holocaust if you hadn't practiced before it became a life and death matter. If you're not willing to stand up for a young girl who's being turned away from a soccer match, you're not going to be able to stand up against an entire race of people under the threat of being wiped out. Yeah, I know, we can't get involved with everything that happens. We have to choose our battles. I'm just saying that if we could get in the habit of standing up for justice more often, we wouldn't have to do it as often, because the world wouldn't believe they could always get away with it. Our government, our religious institutions, our corporations have learned to depend upon our compliance, our silence, our passive indifference, and they've been right almost every time because we've been all those things. Howard Zinn wrote in Failure to Quit, "Civil disobedience is not our problem. Our problem is civil obedience. Our problem is that numbers of people all over the world have obeyed the dictates of the leaders of their government and have gone to war, and millions have been killed because of this obedience. Our problem is that people are obedient all over the world in the face of poverty and starvation and stupidity and war and cruelty. Our problem is that people are obedient while the jails are full of petty thieves, while the grand thieves are running the country. That's our problem. It's a big problem, and it only has one solution, and that solution is you have to decide that you're not going to stand idly by."
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.